So I'm going to. I thought I had an answer this morning. That answer was going to be Breath of the Wild, which is probably my favorite video
That's
game
what I would have
of
predicted.
the last decade.
Yeah.
But I realized, one, Waypoint has always been about all sorts of different types of play, not just video games. And two, if I think about what has been the game that I've kept coming back to the most in the last decade, the game that's defined it is a tabletop game, which is called Dungeon World by Adam Coble and Sage Latura, which
The one we played on the...
the one we played on the launch stream. Yeah, we played with Adam. Adam came and ran it. And it is there's, if I could also do the thing that I suggested with around Spelunky, is like I could have the conversation that is like, here's how this thing influenced the genre of tabletop role playing games, or even I could have chosen a different one to be a little bit more specific. Apocalypse World by D. Vincent Baker and McGuee Baker is probably the one that is the most influential of the last decade of independent role playing games. It's like Dungeon World, a game that's like simplified roles compared to the sort of like big successful games like Dungeons and Dragons, and moved the sort of focus to a kind of collaborative conversational thing and did all sorts of great groundwork. But it was Dungeon World that I played the most. Dungeon World was the tabletop role playing game that was kind of the anchor of Friends at the Table, the podcast I launched like 5 years ago with a bunch of friends. We came back to Dungeon World every other year since then. So like I've been telling a story with Dungeon World for 5 years. It's a game that I think sells the promise of indie tabletop role-playing games really clearly, and it has been since it came out in 2012. It's a game that, instead of asking you to count individual arrows in your quiver, is only really cares when it's narratively interesting that you might be running out of ammo. It's a game that, instead of having a huge list of spells, it really kind of boils down to what's interesting about casting a spell, about potentially losing touch with magic. It's a game that gives you the tools to tell stories that, even though it's still playing with familiar archetypes, you pick a paladin, you pick a cleric, you pick a ranger, and it has all of the kind of like familiarity to that style of fantasy if you want it. It also gives you the freedom to describe what you do instead of look at your list of things you're allowed to do.
Like tools instead of rules, if that's like a basic,
I mean, totally. I think like there are people in the tabletop space who'd be like, no, obviously not tools instead of rules, but that's exactly it.
But yeah, like
that's 100%.
It's like it's a box to be in, but it's not
Correct.
a box to keep you contained.
Right. And I think one of the biggest things about these styles of games, in terms of running them and playing them with your friends, is that from the jump, the system is so clear that hacking it is something that's imaginable. You can make it yours. You can add new stuff to it because the basic dice mechanic is so simple.
Which is you did a lot in terms of like, oh, we've got a bunch of newcomers who are doing this. We're going to toss out some things so we can have some fun.
And you can do that with D&D, but there is a real argument to be made that unless you're playing the game, why play the game if you're not playing the game, right? This stuff is in there for a reason. We've done a lot of balance testing and blah, 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 blah. Dungeon World, Apocalypse World, the kind of powered by the apocalypse stuff, the stuff that's come after that, but influenced by it in a big way, carries forward this idea that, like, one, a game is a conversation. That is what it is. A tabletop role-playing game is fundamentally a conversation between people, and the rules are there to kind of guide that conversation. And two, if you want to do something that isn't in this book, here are the ways to build that thing. You're going to be rolling 2 dice plus some amount of numbers. If you get over a 10, the good thing happens. If you get under a 6, a bad thing happens. If you get a 7 and 9, it's going to be complicated. And that's the other big thing that this style of game added was like, no more hard no's. No more you don't get in the door where there's interesting stuff. No more I have to do 18,000 damage to the dragon. Like, the dragon's have 18 hit points. But how do you take 18 hit points off of a dragon is a really interesting, complicated thing in a world where regular, weapons can't hurt a dragon. And it's like, okay, well, that's a narrative question, but it's being mechanized in a really interesting way. The other great thing about it, and the reason that it's my game of the decade, is I think to some degree answering what is the blank of the decade should almost have, like, it's done. It's the game of the decade because the decade is over now. And this can't be the game of the next decade, because when I look at the games that are coming out now, the stuff that is Forged in the Dark, which is another kind of subgenre of big tabletop games right now, the stuff that is belonging outside belonging, there's like these new schools of thought that make Dungeon World almost antiquated. But it's an antiquated necessity. It's like a stepping stone to what comes next. It's opened up the door. It and Apocalypse World and the other games in that series, or that kind of sub school, have opened up the door for so many new types of game creators.
The same way about Spelunky, right? That's the whole reservation of Spelunky 2.
Exactly.
I don't know that I want Spelunky 2. I want the person who is inspired by Spelunky that makes something that genuinely surprises me.
Yeah, so that is it. That is my game, Dungeon World.
Wow.
Check it out.